Well, this is Dave Gaddis, and today we're interviewing Craig Farmer in his office in Weatherford. This is November 25th, 2014. It's my birthday, so I was about to say my birthday. So,
Happy
Craig,
birthday.
Well, thanks. Why don't we start when and where you were born?
I was actually born in a place called Turlock, California. You want the date? July 11th, 1949. So
And how long did you stay in Turlock?
I was deported when I was about 1. My dad was in the oil business, actually, so we moved around a lot, the western states, Utah and Wyoming, and then my dad moved to Dallas my junior year of high school, and so I graduated from a Dallas high school, which made me a Texas resident. And for university purposes, so then I went on to UT, and my parents immediately left and went back to Colorado, so and left me stranded. I mean, in Texas.
Well, you didn't mention Colorado as one of the places you lived. What were all the places you lived in as a kid?
Oh, I mean, there was like Vernal, Utah, the big points, Casper, Wyoming. Then spent some time in Salt Lake City. Started skiing when I was 11, and so I was there till I was 16, and then came to Texas, and.
Then you went to college at...
My undergraduate was University of Texas.
What did you study?
Well, for 7 years I studied business administration. I had this. Well, first off, I was a ski bum for a year and a half at a ski resort in Utah, Solitude, and then I discovered that a hedonistic lifestyle was kind of boring. So I decided to go to college. So I came back and went to UT for 1 semester and probably rolled my best friend's car and had to drop out and be an iron worker for a year. And then went back and then discovered, make a long story short, I discovered that accounting was not an aptitude that I possess, of keeping track of numbers and things, even though I was in business school and planning to get rich as an accountant, and that did not work out well at all. So after I tanked 2 semesters, I did some aptitude tests, and they came back and said I should think about marine biology or urban planning. So I said, what the heck? So I figured I couldn't really get into marine biology that late in the game, but I'd had real estate courses and stuff, so said, maybe I should try urban planning. So I tried a course at UT and enjoyed it thoroughly, and promptly went to A&M.
So what was your degree in at UT?
Actually, it is business administration, Bachelor's of Business Administration. So
did you go straight to graduate school, or did you?
Well, there's this thing called getting married. Once you get married, you tend to go to class and not party all the time. And so, all of a sudden my grades got really good. So, and then once I got out, I went immediately to A&M. So, matter of fact, I think I graduated in like August, and I started school in September at A&M. So.
Okay. So who were some of the professors you had at A&M?
Some of the classics: Chewy Hinojosa, Joe McGraw, David. Actually, David Pugh was not a prof of mine. I was on the interview panel. I was the student representative on the interview panel that interviewed David Pugh for his position. So that was intriguing. But Chewy Hinojosa, they had some great profs. Okay. So I enjoyed them thoroughly.
How about some of your classmates?
That's real interesting. Bob Bennett was, he and I were very close friends. We have a good story to tell about sitting on a rock and off Monterey drinking whiskey when the tide came in around us and stranded us one night about 2 in the morning on a student field trip. But so anyway, Bob Bennett, who was the city manager of Round Rock for a number of years, Steve Wilkinson, who was influential, I guess, in Austin and San Angelo. Trying to run back through the list of all the folks that I went to school with. There's a picture over on the wall of some of the others, Ken Forte and others.
So you graduated from A&M, newly minted planner, or what did you do?
Well, actually, I went on an internship in McAllen. Then I came back for my last semester, and Steve Wilkinson went on an internship to McAllen. And then we were both worried about jobs, and then it turned out that Michael Blum, who was an Aggie planner at the time, wanted both of us for his new assistant director of planning position, and so he had to make up his mind. And so after a long battle between me and Steve, I'm joking because we're good friends, but I got that job, and then he went on to San Angelo, which worked out perfect for him, and so we were both well suited. So I started in McAllen, Texas. Went down there with my new baby and my wife.
Okay. So. Can you think of some of the projects you did in McAllen? How long were you there?
Actually, I was in McAllen, and back then it seemed like I'd been there forever, but it turned out to only be about 3.5 years. in the late 70s. I graduated from A&M in 75, so I guess technically it was about 4 years. I left in 79, but so yeah, some of the projects I worked on down there, we did the typical, working on the zoning ordinance and subdivision ordinance and all that sort of thing, comp plan. A lot of thoroughfare planning wasn't going on, so I came in and I had what's his name, Stover at A&M, and he showed us how Plano had the 1 mile grid, and so I went down to McAllen and said, you guys don't have a 1 mile grid, you need through streets every mile or better, and they went, oh, okay. So we did a thoroughfare plan. Now all the streets down there's one every mile, and all these streets that we just kind of sketched on the map. Now they're all existing, and matter of fact, a lot of traffic and things. But probably the most influential thing I ended up working on, and probably the best thing I worked on, was we decided to do a 100% land use survey, because we were getting this newfangled thing called GIS, and it actually was one of the first in the state, because it was in 78. We had full-blown GIS. We could analyze parcels and everything, but it was kind of a mainframe data thing, but it was attached to maps, and we could do it. So we decided we needed a 100% survey, so we just did a 100% land use and structural survey, and we actually had interns walking the streets, and in that process, we discovered we had 1,600 dwelling units without indoor plumbing. A lot of them had, they ran sewer lines in the 30s with the WPA project, but they'd put the bathroom out by the alley to save money, because they wouldn't have to run the sewer line out onto the house. So it was like an outhouse with a flush toilet and a shower, okay, basically. But at that point, those things are 40 to 50 years old and falling apart. So, and we had some places where they had 3 or 4 rent houses, with just that one facility. So, and then the housing conditions were actually pretty deplorable. And about the same time, U.S. News and World Report came out with an article that said not only was McAllen the poorest place in the country at that time, poorest SMSA, but that there were pockets of McAllen that McAllen refused to annex because they'd have to pay to improve the streets, put in water, sewer, and things. And that's where we discovered this thing called colonias. And the colonias, they'd never had community development block grant funds. As a matter of fact, they prided themselves that they had never taken federal funds. Well, that's not true, because TxDOT and the airport funds were no problem, but community development block grant, they weren't going to take it. Well, we showed them the colonias, and then we took a slideshow around all the different lunch organizations and Rotary and Lions and all those, and everybody was so appalled at the conditions in the alleys. We had almost as many people living in the alleys as on the streets in some of the lower income areas. Everybody was so appalled about this, they said, we got to do something. And so we found a champion, and a guy named David Farb. He had a furniture store there, and he led the charge. So not only did they go ahead and start using community development block grant funds that next year, but they put together a pot of funds to improve houses. Community development block grant wouldn't let you build a new house, but they'd only let you remodel a house or reconstruct a house. Then we followed up on that with I'd read an article in, believe it or not, a planning magazine. And one of the things you'll learn about me is I synthesize things. I just find little pieces of things and pull them together. I don't go in depth. And so I just read this 3-page article about this organization called Dallas Neighborhood Housing Services, Inc., and how they improve neighborhoods. And I said, we need one of those. So I threw that out with Mike Blum and this David Farb and in the group, and they came back and said, we can do that. So they set up a nonprofit. It was called McAllen Housing Services, Inc., and they hired an administrator, and then they used the community development block grant funds. They got a group of banks together to put pots of money together, risky funds, and then they used the community development block grant funds to guarantee the loans. So the loans weren't actually CDBG money. The loans were guaranteed for bank money that was being loaned to remodel houses. So they started in. I talked to Mike Blum the other day, and he said the organization is now called Valley Housing Services, I believe is the name of it, and they go all up and down the border in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and I think they've done over 3,000 houses now. They've remodeled and fixed them up, and so when it came time for FAICP, I put in all my big fancy projects, and the one that came back they recognized the most and said that was most worthy of being a fellow was the the one I did my first 2 years on the job. So, okay. So.
Well, you'd mentioned Planning Magazine. At what point in time did you get involved in APA? Or were you in AIP before they merged?
Well, I was in AIP, and I was also a huge fan of ASPO because their magazine was much easier to read than all those AIP journals. I like the superficial things. So anyway, so I liked ASPO a bunch. And then...
did you get involved in college? Or?
Yes, absolutely. Joe McGraw and some of the others insisted that we be involved. And so as a student, I went to the short course and volunteered time and to help people out. What was her name? Not Elizabeth Butler, Ellen Butler in Austin.
Evelyn Butler?
Evelyn Butler, yes, thank you. Anyway, and so but they told me that was the best way to network and find jobs, and that has absolutely turned out to be true. So that was my first involvement, was just as a student volunteer.
Okay. So after McAllen, where did you go?
Well, then I had met, speaking of networking, they had a chapter conference in McAllen, and I met a guy named George Heumann, who was the planning director of Fort Worth, and he and I hit it off pretty good. And so he resigned from Fort Worth and went to work for Freese Nichols. And so George said, Craig, why don't you come to work for Freese Nichols? Well, I digress a little bit. I decided to go into business for myself. And so I left McAllen. For 6 months, I had my own little business, and I was doing just a few zoning cases here and there. And I said, I'll never work for a city again. So I took my retirement money out of the municipal retirement system, which turned out to be a huge mistake. But anyway, I'll never work for a city again. So I started my own little business. I was going to get rich and famous, and I discovered there's a lot of work in doing that, especially when you're on your own. And so George called me up, and, hey, so I moved to Austin.
So what was the name of your business?
Craig Farmer and Associates,
okay.
The real original name.
Okay.
That helped sell the deal for sure.
So then you went to work for Freese Nichols in Austin?
In Austin from 1979 till 1982 with George Heumann, and I guess he started up the Austin office, and so then they brought me on to be the planner for the whole organization, and then there were a couple other planners came on board about the same time. Some guy named Dave Gaddis, and he's more the environmental side, and there's some guy named Dan Boutwell, and so before you knew it, we had 3 or 4 planners, so it was fine. Randy Hankamer was another one. And consultant was an interesting learning curve with Randy Hankamer because I didn't have a clue how to put together an actual planning document, and he'd been doing them out in California. So I'd tell people that he laid out the table of contents, how many pages in each chapter, et cetera, and there you go. It's going to be 340 pages. It's going to take us this many hours. How'd you do that? We haven't even written it. And he says, "Oh, you just guess." So he kind of taught me everything I know. He was brilliant, and I miss him. So.
Do you remember any of the projects you worked on?
Well, we had some fun ones. San Marcos was working on their 5th city manager in 7 years, and so they brought us in to clean up the development codes and the ordinances and do a comp plan. So we did that. They had 17 neighborhood organizations, a lot of environmentalists, a lot of developers and locals, and a lot of acrimony and stuff. And planning really worked in that case. It smoothed things out. We got a consensus on what to do. We rewrote the codes, and so we won awards from the chapter for the plan. Then I went up to this town called Grapevine, and Grapevine was kind of a world of hurt. Mayor Tate, who's still in Grapevine, was there, but small town next to DFW Airport, which overshadowed it, and they didn't know what to do about things. And so one of the innovative things I did there was I said, well, why don't we go over to TxDOT and get copies of all their maps and put it on your base map? And so we did that, and we came back, and all the roads that were planned were suddenly on one document. And they went, oh my God, it looks like a spaghetti bowl. All these roads are planned? I said, yep, that's TxDOT's plans, and I'd never seen a document that had it all on one sheet. And so it was an eye-opening experience for them. And then you add in the noise contours, and that they didn't realize that impact. So we took the DFW noise contours and just some more basic good old planning 101, and we ended up with a document that also won an award from the state. And that one was actually just an update of their comp plan. So those were probably the 2 best ones. I did work in Mission, McAllen, Sonora, Texas. Quick story about Sonora. So they didn't have a wastewater or water map anywhere in the organization, and we were using 701 funds. So we went in there and So we did their first base maps and gave them the base maps, and they had a guy in the warehouse as usual that was about 80 years old. And so we gave them some colored pencils and told them to mark down all the waterline sizes. You know, red would be this size and blue would be that size. And so we get the maps back, and the colors don't make any sense at all. They're all messed up. But next to each line where he sketched them in was a little notation, 18-inch, 12-inch, whatever. So we called him up and said, "What the heck? You didn't follow the rules on the colored pencils." He says, "Well, I'm colorblind. I can't see them, but I went ahead and used my pencil. You said I had to use those pencils, so I did, but I went ahead and noted which ones were what." So,
So after Freeze Nichols, where?
so after Freeze and Nichols, I went to the city of Grand Prairie. I was their first planning director. They did have some staff that was processing zoning cases and things, but they weren't really planning. And so I was there. I was only there 2 years. But we did a lot of good work, and Buddy Keisel and various other folks were there, and I think we actually won an award or two while we were doing that stuff. And I'd been there 2 years, and then a gentleman by the name of Mike Eastland was the city manager of Carrollton, and he called me up to see if I'd be on an interview panel for his planning director position to start the first, planning group in Carrollton. So I said, "Sure, I'll be on the interview panel." And we're sitting there interviewing and talking, and the more I get to think about it, and I said, went up to him as I'm going, I said, "You know what, I might be interested in this job." And he says, "Well, you can't be on the panel anymore." And I said, "Well, that's for sure." So I was off the panel and no longer a voting member of anything. And so then I interviewed, and I landed the Carrollton job. So my first tour of Grand Prairie, it's kind of hard to remember, but I think it was just the basics, existing land use, there was some new lake being planned. So we were starting to plan around the lake. Nobody had any plans for the lake or what was going to happen around it. And so most of it, I think, was just the basics that first 2 years. And then I came back later and did a lot more. But
So what all did you do in Carrollton?
so in Carrollton, I was there in Carrollton 4 years. Okay, and we did a lot of good, but I did a lot of downtown work. And they were building the new city hall, and they're going to take the city staff out of the downtown. So downtown had a lot of problems. So we put together a downtown plan. They used some guy named Dennis Wilson to create a downtown plan, and he to prove the point about traffic and speed of traffic. We were in a hearing one night in the downtown pharmacy, and while we're there, somebody totaled his car just outside the window, just drove right into it at a high rate of speed and totaled it. So we always said that he gave almost the ultimate for the sake of the plan. But there we got into some things like the Trinity Tollway, which ended up being not Trinity Tollway at that time. It was just 190. I'm sorry, but Trinity Parkway, Trinity Boulevard. Totally lost. Wrong part of town. That's Grand Prairie, but the Hebron Parkway and some of that stuff out there. Had some good times duking it out with the city of Plano on annexation wars. And if anybody ever wants to do a study, there's a good one with the little town of Hebron that was created for the sole purpose of not letting any big cities annex them. And used to work with, can't remember his first name, Dillard. But he was with Nichols firm, law firm. So then meeting whoever the mayor's living room was, and for that 2 years, about 6 farmers, ranchers, and they'd just meet and not let anybody annex them. And then when one of them said they wanted to sell some land, then they'd arrange a little 50-foot strip around it, and it would go to whoever gave them the best deal on zoning. And so sometimes Plano got it, and sometimes we got it. But then some guy named Henry Billingsley came in, and kind of related to Lucy Crowe Billingsley. But anyway, so he came in with an idea for about 1,000 acres, and he said, "Well, the colony is going to give me a 4-to-1 floor area ratio," which everybody knows is absurd on 1,000 acres. And said, "What do you do for us?" And so they talked to Plano, and Plano basically said, you can have big houses like Bentry and all that kind of stuff next to it, and that's it. So they didn't like that answer. They came to us and said, "Now, we've already talked to the colony. We're probably going to give them 400 or 500 acres anyway, but if you want 400 or 500 acres to be annexed into your town, what do you do for us?" So we conceded to a 1-to-1 floor area ratio, which is equally absurd. But we stuck all kinds of site planning and traffic impact analysis and everything else on it, so that you couldn't do anything without having the heck studied out of it and demonstrating that it would work. And so anyway, Frank Turner was he was a little bothered about that. But they left a little 50-foot strip around the whole Plano city limit line to make sure that Plano couldn't touch them, and they disannexed the strip around next to Carrollton, so we annexed them.
Who were some of the staff people at Carrollton?
A guy named Mark Guy. He's assistant city manager still. Gosh, that's a long ways back. Trying to remember them all.
Well, that's okay. And then after Carrollton,
Milburn Gravely, they used to own the hardware store. It's amazing how many times mayors are hardware store owners in the community. So Milburn Gravely that owned the hardware stores there. And Kenny Marchant ended up being a legislator, and there's the Marchant family that has been very active for years and years. And Mike Eastland, who's now executive director of the North Texas Council of Governments, was just awesome as a city manager. And that was a great, fun 4 years while I was there. Enjoyed that immensely.
And so after Carrollton?
Well, after Carrollton, then the city manager, the new city manager in Grand Prairie, Texas, got hold of me. He used to be the public works director, and Wendell Halsey was his name. When I was in the first tour, I worked with a guy named Ted Willis, who was the city manager of Grand Prairie, and he ended up being the executive director of the Texas Municipal League. And so then the second tour was Wendell Halsey, who was the public works director. So it was one of those unique things. I committed to him I'd come back because he said, I need help. I'll make you an assistant city manager or a deputy city manager when you come back. And I said, up to this point, I'd only been over planning departments, and so I said, okay. So about that same time, I got headhunters calling and saying, you don't need to worry about that. We got jobs for you in other places. And I said, well, I already shook his hand, and he's already put it in the newspaper. I can't really back out. So I went back to Grand Prairie, and I was actually there from about 89 until 2000, so about 11 years. He was a great city manager as far as the operations went, but he wasn't very visionary, I guess I'd say. Plus, he had a lot of clout in the community, so when council members would try to play games, he'd, no, we're not going to do that. So anyway, he lasted about a year and a half, 2 years, and then they asked him to resign. So one day, I came in, and he was packing his box. And, whoa! So they brought in a new man, Gary Gwynn, who used to be an assistant city manager in Fort Worth, and then he was over in Tyler as city manager, and he became a city manager there. And so I was under Gary for, I want to say about 8 years probably out of that time frame. And we had the horse racing election for the Lone Star Park. And so I was involved in the factual side of the bond issue and the factual side of the election. Actually on that one there wasn't a bond issue, but there was on some other things. But that was a half-cent sales tax, so there was an election for the half-cent sales tax. And and then once it passed, I got involved on the construction side of Lone Star Park, the construction/city side. And so it ended up being a $110 million project. Had a lot of fun because we had two competing groups that wanted the racetrack license, and so I got to work with a guy named Preston Carter and Jim Musselman on the one side, and then on the other side were the Crows and that group. So we didn't, and that we were competing with the city of Dallas and with Willow Park for the license. And Willow Park is just trying to preserve their position. They had a Class 2 racetrack, and they just wanted to be Class 1. And then Dallas, of course, had the Pinnacle Park location that they were pushing, and then we had our two locations. And the interesting thing was the Preston Carter group got the racetrack license, and they were going to take the old wildlife park that was significantly prone to flooding and convert that to a racetrack. They were actually working on the plans, and then the Crow organization got with them and said, how about we just either make you partners or give you money and we get the license? And they said, sure. So they sold their license to the Crow organization. That's how the park ended up where it is. And it worked out real well because there was a flood control district that was bankrupt underneath it. So it solved the bankrupt flood control district plus created a park there. And then, Next Stage came in. It was called Next Stage, the Verizon Performing Arts Theater was called Next Stage at the time, and I got involved in all those negotiations, and that was fun. I did not get involved in the air hog thing, so that was not my deal, but the other two were. So,
Okay.
and Joe Pool Lake, Lake Ridge Parkway, and all that. That was all sketched out on tracing paper in our offices. And my staff even gave me a signed copy of one of the sketches because of how badly I sketch, and so the tracing paper was kind of amateurish, but all the roads were in place and where they need to be, and they all ended up being where they are. So, Broad Street turned into Charlie England Boulevard, and so all that was just on paper. They didn't have anything prior to that. They knew where the two bridges were going to go, so they basically knew where Great Southwest and Lake Ridge more or less would go. But everything else we created in the way of the road system and infrastructure down there, just planned it out.
So after the second tour of Grand Prairie.
Well, let me finish Grand Prairie. I guess a couple other things. So we got involved in the negotiations on South 360. Getting the right of way and extending it on down to the lakes and everything. I got to work with Rose Jacobson in Arlington to swap land because the city limits didn't follow 360, the freeway. It meandered, and so people would have wrecks and they wouldn't know where to assign the fatality kind of a thing or who should respond. I got to work with Mike Coker in Dallas on Joe Pool because the city limits and the lake followed the old creek that was there before the lake. So once the lake was there, there's this meandering city limits through the middle of Joe Pool. That one kind of went south. My city council loved it. I guess I can say this: his city council, he did claim that it was the worst beating he'd ever had in front of his council for the best deal he'd ever taken him, which was basically, give us control of the lake and we'll go ahead and continue to give you revenues from it. But we had to figure out, who served what part of the lake when there was a drowning or something. He said he took a deal to him that was the best deal he'd ever seen, and he got beat up because the certain council members didn't want any of their Dallas citizens being harassed in that town, Grand Prairie, over there to the west. So he's got good stories to tell about that one. So.
Yeah, Grand Prairie had kind of a reputation of being kind of a blue-collar town.
It was kind of brass knuckles at the time. Matter of fact, when I first took a job in Grand Prairie, I was told that it wouldn't look bad on my resume if I got fired from Grand Prairie. So the horse racing track really changed the image. The mayor there, Charlie England, was actually pretty incredible because he came in and he said, you know what, we're going to get business friendly, we're going to make things happen. And so we suddenly had power to really do some things to make things more streamlined. We came up with an innovative concept. We actually won a national award for this concept we took all the planned developments, and like a number of North Texas cities, we had a couple hundred planned developments. And then we created kind of a boutique list of districts, and basically there was like a table of equalization that said, if you've got a planned development for, GR, if you will agree to meet all the requirements of GR-2, which is increased landscaping and this and that, then it's just a staff process, and you don't have to go to the council or the P&Z or anybody. You just got to meet the requirements of that, plus any unique requirements in there, like an 8-foot screening fence or whatever it might be. And so that just streamlined the heck out of it because people just really didn't like standing up in front of P&Z and council every time they wanted to do anything. And so we suddenly got a good reputation for being business friendly. And plus, I digress. I'd moved up, and so I was ended up being deputy city manager there. So I was over the taking over the Kroger building and creating a one-stop shop development center, which is still there and functioning really well. Bill Crowley took that over and ramped it up even more. He's doing awesome over there. But so I got to work on Lone Star Park and that, then Trinity Boulevard. That one's the right Trinity Boulevard, and other things there to make it happen. So I was there till, I want to say 1999, almost 2000. Did a lot of good things, a few bad things, but most of good things.
So after Grand Prairie.
So, and I'd kind of been looking, but it was, after '89, if you recall, there was this kind of a recession kind of a thing, or early '90s. And so I was a finalist in Las Vegas, Nevada. Donna Christoponis beat me out. I think it was probably a good thing because they probably would have eaten me alive out there. And Tempe, Arizona, and places like that. But I wasn't looking hard, but I just kind of wanted to see what was going on outside the state. I'm really glad. I mean, somebody's watching out for me that I didn't get any of those jobs because they're not even the same retirement system, and it's a whole different world in some of the other states. So I suddenly had like 3 job offers at the same time. So I called up my friend Dennis Wilson. I said, Dennis, I'm not sure which job to take. He said, well, you got 2 consulting jobs plus this job in Lubbock. And Jim Bertram had kind of gotten hold of me and said, Craig, and he'd been there 30-something years. So we need someone to keep going with all the good projects out here. And I said, I think I might be interested. And so we were talking. So anyway, I was talking to Dennis Wilson, and he said, let me ask you a question. How many more years do you have till you can retire in TMRS? And I said, well, I got 23 years in, so just 2 more years I could retire. And he says, are you an idiot? Why are you even asking me? So he said, you get 2 more years and you're good. So I went to Lubbock, and instead of 2 years, I ended up being there 5. And we had a good time in Lubbock. I guess the thing I'm most proud of out there is they had next to Texas Tech, they had a neighborhood. They jokingly called it the student ghetto, but it was 93% rental, highest crime rates. Most of the crime was taking place in those areas. And what finally did it was they found a dead crack dealer on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of the street. Didn't know how he got there, but it was a football Saturday. So that tore it. So some guy named Delbert McDougal came to the city and said, hey, if you, the city, will come up with some money to redo the streets, I'll buy up all the private property and redo it. And so the city said, well, we got a little bit of money. How much do you need? He says, well, at least $4 or $5 million. He said, well, we were thinking like $400,000 out of the solid waste fund. I said, that won't do anything. I can't do anything with that. So I was new in town, been there about 6 months. And when we did Lone Star Park and Joe Pool Peninsula, we created some TIF districts. And I neglected to mention Tom Hart became the city manager when Gary Gwynn moved on to the Brazos River Authority. And Tom Hart was big on TERSs. And matter of fact, we created 3 tax increment reinvestment districts, and we had 29 separate agreements. The state law changed on September 1 to no longer allow school districts to participate. We talked to all the school districts, and the school districts all wanted to participate because it was a way that they could keep money at home instead of shipping it off through Robin Hood. So they said, if you'll build us a $10 million school, we'll give you $30 million. That was a good deal for them and a good deal for us. So we did TERS districts with all the school districts except the Mansfield School District. They chose not to, but Cedar Hill did, the Grand Prairie Independent did, and Arlington School District did. So we had 29 separate agreements that we negotiated over the space of 1999, just before the law changed, and the council held a meeting on August the 30th, the night before the law changed, and adopted and signed all the contracts and agreements in one session. So, and it's 3 of the biggest TERSs around. Plus we had 2 different counties, a number of hospital districts and college districts and things like that. So, multiple agreements. So, make a long story short, I get to Lubbock, and because I could spell TERS, they said, why don't you come help us with this? And so we were able to basically get the numbers right. It was he was planning on about $180 million of private investment, and we said, well, if you'll do that, we can do $15 to $20 million of public investment or reinvestment and redo the streets and everything. And so we put together a TERS district and without schools, because you couldn't do that anymore, but everybody else participated. And everybody else was desperate, even the the groundwater district. I mean, they had a little minuscule, but they wanted to be a player. They wanted to be involved because everybody wanted something done because it was dragging down the university. And we actually did a little quick and dirty study, and it turns out about 60 universities around the country are inner city universities, and the cities were deteriorating around them. So they said Ohio State and Columbus was probably the best example of the city working with the university to redevelop the areas around the university and protect it, because it's such a huge investment, and when the neighborhoods are deteriorating around, the crime rate's going up, and people don't want to send their kids there anymore, then you're actually losing a major investment for your community. So we kind of followed the Ohio State model a little bit, and then we went off on our own, did our own thing. But bottom line was, last I heard, he's up to about $500 million of private investment, and the TERS itself is up to about $60 to $70 million of redevelopment. Did a mile-long boulevard through the middle of it. The staff said couldn't be done, so I made him run me a subdivision plat for every one of the plats, and I scotch taped them all together in my living room and had a 22-foot-long map, and I drew the boulevard in and showed him it could be done. So, but it was outside what they normally did. So,
as I recall, it's got mixed-use buildings.
Mixed use, got a hotel, convention center. It's got roundabouts. Well, and again, Dennis Wilson was pretty involved in that with a lot of the concepts. The state at one point was going to be involved, and they chose not to. But they were going to buy up some big properties too and put some buildings in there. But the thing has gone so much quicker and faster than anybody anticipated. But you know, the flip side is, and we had to convince the council of this, that redevelopment compared to greenfield development is 5 times more expensive and takes 5 times longer. But you got to do something. You just can't leave it sitting there festering and dragging the whole city down. So, and like I said, it's probably my mantra. There's nothing better than a good example of a bad example, and you know, just have your plans waiting in the wings, and then when they find the crack needle in the middle of the street and say we got to do something, you go, oh, I haven't have a plan. So anyway, I had a long, fun relationship with Delbert McDougall, the private side developer. And
anything else in Lubbock that you want to talk about?
we did a plan for the Northeast. Got to work with Henry Cisneros and his firm on it, and others. It's not come along as well as I'd hoped, but because there's, you know, it's like any city. There's a certain part of the city that has a certain image. It turns out a lot of it's not true. Crime rates really aren't that high out there, but it's lower income, so everybody assumes it's got those issues. The downtown, we put together a TERS for the downtown too, and then just a lot of the general planning of the city. First thoroughfare plan, actual thoroughfare plan on a map. I mean, they'd done some thoroughfare planning. I'm sorry, I lied. Back in about '82, they had done a plan, but this was like 2002. so we created a new plan. Milwaukee Boulevard, I was in charge of that. And again, you know, I started off being the planning and development, transportation director, and next thing you knew, I was upstairs in the manager's office, and I had almost all the departments that built anything except utilities. So, you know, at that point, I had about 350 employees, and spent most of my time in grievances doing management rather than planning, which wasn't that much fun, as you well know.
So you got at least your 2 years for TMRS.
Got 2 years plus 3.
Yeah.
So, matter of fact, I was adding up the numbers when I was 57 and looking at it. I said, you know what? I don't think I can afford to stay here, because I had kids about to head off to college. So I pulled the plug and went for work for some guy named Dan Sefco, and with his group. And basically, I started up Craig Farm and Associates again, the well-known firm, and I sold Dan 100% of my hours. So it was working out pretty well for both of us until after I'd been there about 2 years, he called me in one day and says, Craig, got bad news and good news. And I went, what? He says, well, bad news is we're being bought out by an engineering firm. Oh man, you know, I guess I can go start looking. He said, well, the good news is Freese Nichols, you've already worked there. I said, oh great, I can do that. So went to work there. So I actually ended up with about 7 years of consulting between Dan's shop and then the Freese and Nichols folks. And
what are some of the projects you did on the second tour of Freese and Nichols?
The second tour of Freese and Nichols, well, let me think. I had a whole bunch of giant ones. Level Land, Texas, you know. When you're consulting, a lot of the projects you work on aren't that big. But they pay the bills, and they're fun. I mean, it's fun to get your arms around a smaller city, and the best part about a smaller city is they get excited. You know, you go to a large city, and a lot of times they're a little bit jaded about planning, and they're just the hired help. You know, and you go to a small town, boy, they bring coffee and donuts to the public meetings and stuff, and it's a lot of fun. So, did work down in Shenandoah. We got an actual award we wrote the first zoning ordinance in Tomball, Texas, town of about 10,000. Just north of Houston. And of course the Houston anti-zoning advocates showed up at the meetings to try to poison it like it was going to hurt them. So, but anyway, we knocked that one out. ended up got the job in Midland to do the 191 corridor study, and that was a tough one because you had a lot of different interests. The oil and gas industry was out there just going gangbusters, and what are we going to do about all the land around it? It was outside the city. It was being stripped out with oil and gas. Businesses that didn't even want to pave a parking lot. They just liked their gravel, service industry type stuff. So we walked a fine line on that, and we actually ended up doing a good plan and ended up getting an award on that one. So, yeah.
Did some work in El Paso, as I recall.
Well, how could I forget that? I used to call them my public beatings, my bi-monthly beatings. No, El Paso was interesting because the development community pretty much ran it, and so then they got the first city manager, number one. Number two was the first female city manager, and she actually had a long stint. She's probably there 9 or 10 years, I guess, was all said and done. But so they brought us in to kind of rework their subdivision ordinance, and of course the subdivision ordinance was kind of, I wouldn't call it homegrown, but it evolved over the years. So there are two things basically wrong with it. One was they threw everything in the kitchen sink in there, so because people wanted to see it in writing. What do you mean? How many blue lines do I have to have? 26. Well, show me in writing where I have to have 26 blue lines. So right here in the ordinance. Well, obviously over time, all those detailed standards became a problem. So they literally had the ordinance and they had what they really do in a separate file cabinet. So yeah, the ordinance says 26, but we'll let you get by with 8. That's all we really need. And so they had this long, convoluted ordinance. But the other problem with it was strongly oriented towards the developer and things like. Well, just a lot of concepts that are standard. Most places were foreign there. For example, there you didn't have to turn in the engineering plans with the final plat. You could turn in the final plat, get it recorded, and then turn in the engineering plans while you're selling lots. Well, needless to say, sometimes they discovered that they needed some drainage easements or things, and the plat was already filed. I'll never forget the one comment because, well, I used to go out there every 2 weeks to meet with this committee made up of some of the more prominent developers and a council member representative and a couple of neighborhood representatives. And of course, some of these developers were pretty adamant, pretty strong-willed, and so I called it my bi-weekly beating. For 2 years, I flew out there every 2 weeks and went to another meeting. But we were making headway on stuff and a lot of compromises, and so there was some give and take. And I think they ended up with an ordinance that worked for them, but I'll never forget the statement, why should we turn in the engineering drawings with the final plat or before the final plat and get them approved before the final plat's filed? And I said, because things happen in the field and, you may end up selling lots that you can't serve. And they said, well, that's not a problem out here. And I said, well, what about the guy that committed suicide on the mountain because he couldn't get sewer service to the 50-something lots he'd sold and they were having to haul it out in trucks? Well, that's just an isolated incident. So anyway, So it went around and around, but we ended up, El Paso was named the planning community of the year that year, and then the ordinance itself had some great rough proportionality wording, thanks to Kim Mickelson and others, and I think Terry Morgan had a hand in it too at some point, just other things, and so we brought them up to speed. They do require utility drawings now prior to filing the final plat and approve them. They also require surety if you're going to get building permits, prior to construction of everything. And, just some of those concepts like that, we got all that to work. And so that also won a state planning award. So
how'd you end up in Weatherford?
Well, it was a long and convoluted story. No, I was actually asked to come into Weatherford as a consultant at Freese & Nichols, and so for about 6 months I was assisting staff on trying to sort through the ordinances. And it's a similar thing you run into all the time of everybody at home that doesn't work in any other cities say this is the worst place I've ever seen, the worst planning department I've ever seen. And sometimes that's true, but most of the time what I found is the out-of-towners say, oh, these guys are great to work with, and the locals saying, these guys are terrible to work with. And you go, have you done work in other places, other bigger cities? Well, no, it's just that they're terrible to work with here. So you go, okay. And so Weatherford had some of that going on, that some of the locals were really upset about things, and some of the out of town firms would just say, no, they're really good to work with. So I was trying to help them sort through where the problem areas were, and one day the assistant city manager, Sharon Hayes, said, can we get you to come work for us? And I went, well, I don't know. And I'd actually been kind of liking Weatherford, and one of the things that happens when you're traveling around the state, as you know, visiting lots of smaller communities, you kind of look at them and you kind of keep going, could I live here? Do I like this place? And sometimes you could, sometimes you couldn't, but never anything overwhelming. And so I'd been in Lubbock 14 years. Well, at that point it was about 13 years. And so I was looking at the town, the old courthouse, the historic neighborhoods, and she was asking me this question, so I said, well, the first issue is I got to make the same amount of money as I get at Freeze and Nichols. She said, we can do that. Oh, I said, well, and I'll have to go home on weekends for a while because my youngest daughter's a junior in high school, and I don't want to take her out until after she graduates, and so I need to work 4 10-hour days and go there on weekends and live in an apartment here. We can do that. Oh, okay. So I kind of ran through the list of problems, and we can make that work. Yeah, we can figure out a way to do this. And go, whoa, so I'll never forget, I went down to this little park here called Cherry Park, and I'm sitting there trying to make up my mind about whether I'm going to do it or not. And I'm thinking about, they're trying to create cities like this, neo-traditional, where you can live close to work, and you got parks with swimming pools in them. And so there's this, I call it the Back to the Future movement. But anyway, there's people trying to create what's already here. So I said, I think, and I was watching the kids play, and there was an elderly retired couple sitting there having a picnic lunch just in the middle of the day at a park, and just a block away from downtown. I went, I think I can do this. So now I've got a house 3 blocks from here, so I can walk to work in the morning, or I can eat in about 6 different restaurants downtown and walk home if I need to, after having a drink or 2 of wine. Anyway, boutique liquor stores and shopping and stuff, so I'm just having a good time. So life's good.
So we've gone through your professional career, and then you've also had a parallel APA career.
Well, that is a whole different story, yeah.
You've gone way back. You talked about being a student volunteer at the short course.
Is that where we left that off?
How did you first get involved in APA as a section officer or chapter officer? Or?
Well, where that story comes from. So I'm new in Austin, and so I get involved in the Austin section because the Valley didn't really have a section when I was down there. I mean, and because it's so far away from everybody else, and I think they were in the southmost San Antonio section, I believe. But, so we were involved in APA, and I'd always go to the national and state conferences from Austin, but I never really got involved. From McAllen, and I never really got involved. So I get to Austin, and, they have a Central Texas section. This is cool, so I can go to the meetings. So I must have gone to 4 or 5 meetings in a row, and they said, Craig, you should be the section director. Okay, I guess I'll be the section director. So I was the section director of the Austin section for about 4 months until I moved to Grand Prairie. So I said, I can't be section director anymore. So I get to Grand Prairie, and then I get a phone call one day. They need someone to run for chapter president. And I said, well, I guess I could do that. I won't mention names, but so I ran for chapter president and as the dark horse, and I ended up winning, which was kind of weird. So I won the chapter presidency. Well, Bruce McClendon decided to hand off the chapter presidency to me, so he drove by and left about 4 boxes in my driveway and called and said, all the boxes in your driveway, that's all you need to know about being chapter president. So anybody that's been chapter president, as you know, it's actually a huge job. So I went to my first conference in '83 as the Texas chapter president, and went to the CPC, Chapter President's Committee, Chapter President Council. And so I go there, and I guess the first one was in Tampa, come to think of it. So that's where the notorious reputation started. There was a guy, well, actually there were 3 chapter presidents at that time called Farmer. There was George Farmer from Ohio, a guy named Paul Farmer from Minnesota, and then Craig Farmer from Texas. So I called it, George, Paul, and my other brother Craig. But anyway, so so I go to the conference in Tampa and get to meeting people. So I met Connie Cooper and Angela Harper and Chris McKettrick and some guy named Dan Bird. and I can run down the list of all these different personalities. But it was one of those magic moments in time when everything just kind of hits. So, and we actually went out and socialized that night, me on crutches, which my wife was real impressed when I was dancing on my crutches. But anyway, as a group, we really clicked, and so they've almost all ended up being something in the leadership. And so I was chapter president. I was on the chapter president's council. I was chapter president, yeah, for 2 years. I can do this.
Well, before we get away from the chapter presidency,
yes.
Can you remember some of the issues that you addressed? Or
well, yeah. Yeah, the Education Foundation was going full tilt, and we embellished on that, got that going. We had the biggest conference at the time up in Dallas at the Lincoln Center, I guess you'd call it. The awards committee at that point in time wanted to make the chapter president's award, and I said, no, you don't get to do that. That's my award. And so we had an argument about it. So I ended up giving Sally Shipman, the Austin City Council member, an award, and I gave her my APA pin and said, here's your award, because the committee wouldn't give me one to give to her. There was a guy named Jim Duncan. And he called me one night, and I'm chapter president, been chapter president for about 3 months. And he called me one night about 10 o'clock on like a Wednesday night. So I'm Jim Duncan, I'm the chapter president from Florida. Okay. And he says, I'm over here at the Anatole. Why don't you come over and have a margarita? Of course, anybody knows Jim knows he's famous for his margaritas. And I said, well, I guess so. I hadn't thought about it. So I head out about 10:30, get to the Anatole about 11. He starts in talking about all the things they started doing in Florida, and we sat there until they closed the bar. And he introduced the concept of an executive director. He introduced the concept to me of a newsletter on a monthly basis. And so basically I stole Jim's ideas and implemented them here, which again is something I'm really good at, synthesizing and stealing. But so we in fact did hire an executive director, and I think it was a part-time person. I don't remember who it was, the first one. I can't even remember. Anyway, and we did have a newsletter editor, and we were committed to paying the postage and getting out a newsletter once a month. Of course, back then we didn't have internet, so it was something in the mail once a month, and may even started quarterly for a little bit, and then it got to be once a month. And but I think those two things, an executive director to get things done, and a newsletter really made a difference.
Do you remember some of the people on the chapter board at the time?
Cool. Oh, there was a guy named Mark Baber. He was awesome. He was my treasurer, and he was actually the go-getter that got a lot of things accomplished. Oh Lord, I'd have to look, see who the assistant director and some. I remember on the Education Foundations we had was it Terry Kahn, I guess, from University of Texas, and Kent Butler, and I'm trying to remember who UTA, and Joe Goldstein was involved for a while. Some of the UTA folks, I think they're, a different number of people. David Pugh, of course, from the A&M side. And back then we used to have the chapter board in the morning and the Education Foundation in the afternoon. So there was a lot of crossover. I'm trying to remember some of the section directors and things, but. So.
Well, that's okay. So you got involved after being chapter president. You had got involved in this group with CPC. Did you end up? What was your next step?
Well, it was a checkered process, because when I became deputy city manager of things, okay, I got away from APA to some extent, okay, and then I got back into I was a deputy city manager in Grand Prairie, but I had some issues because I'd been there more than 5 years, and anybody that's been in a town more than 5 years knows that things come back to haunt you sometimes. Anyway, what you call baggage, I guess. And so I got moved back to being over all the development departments from the deputy city manager position. They brought in a guy named Joe Bellardi from Fort Worth, and Joe was superb. They put him over me, and all the things I'd been telling them, they wouldn't believe because it was Craig and he's been here forever. So they bring Joe in from Fort Worth. Joe knows everything, and Joe's a smart man. Joe could say, Craig, what do you think about this? And I'd tell him what I think. He says, sometimes he didn't agree, but sometimes he'd go, yeah, you're right. And he'd go and say, I think we should do this. And I go, you're brilliant, Joe. So it actually worked out well for both of us because it took the heat off of me. But I was back in planning, not so much over fire departments and all the rest of the things. And actually, in retrospect, it was a good move. I mean, I'm not a great, I'm okay at management, but I'm better at planning. And I'm pretty good at leading departments, but leading entire organizations, I don't know that I'm great at that either. So I get back there, I'm back in planning, and so I start catching up with all my old friends. Well, then one day they called me up and said, "We want you to run for the national board." And I think at that point we'd only ever had one national board member, if I recall correctly. I may be wrong. We may not have ever had a national board member at that point. And so Florida, who had a lot more AICP, or they didn't even have AICP, but a lot more professional practicing planners in Florida, decided that Texas should have a board rep. So Florida, lets Texas know that, So I ran against this poor guy named Robert Barber from Mississippi that had 80 members in APA, and we had like 1,600 members, and Florida had 2,000. So anytime Florida wanted to do something, they'd just go win. But this time they didn't put anybody in the race, and so poor Bob, he and I are running for the national office, and needless to say, it was a slam dunk, not because of my overwhelming great credentials versus his. I think his is probably just as good, if not better, but because we had a whole lot more people. And so I got Freudian. I got put on the national board for 4 years, and it was a great ride. It was tumultuous, but it was a great ride. For those of the Robert Barber, on his own, with very little help from his own personal chapter, actually ended up being on the national board and is now, I guess, president of AICP, right?
He's on the board of AICP.
He's on the board of AICP.
He
He took
took Val's.
Val. That's correct. Yeah. So anyway, he's done fine, as he should. But yeah, and so we kid about that first race, and I still say, poor bastard running with 80 people to vote, and so.
So who was the APA president, and who was on the board at the time you were on the board?
Well, Eric Kelly was the president at the time I got on the board, and after Eric was, from New Jersey. Never forget those folks. But it's kind of funny because I ended up on the board with Chris McKettrick and others. Sarah Moore was on the board. And plus my old running buddies, Dan Bird and all the rest of them, we picked up where we'd left off. I basically dropped out. I paid my dues, but I basically dropped out for about 5 or 6 years and didn't really go to conferences and things. So we picked up where we left off, but I can't.
That's all right.
Yeah, just drawing blanks. Yeah,
And you and Dan are best known at CPC dance parties as...
absolutely. As the Blues Brothers. We started as the Blues Brothers, so you do digress. But that came out of that Tampa deal, because there was a guy there named Dan Bird, and we're having this board meeting, or the council meeting, and he kept wanting to bifurcate the motion or point of order, and everybody's just about to strangle the guy. He just, what a weird guy. And so, matter of fact, we're all climbing into cabs to go to a place called Studebakers to go dancing, and we don't know anybody. Okay, this is the first time, but yeah, I'll go. So I get my crutches in the cab, and then Connie Cooper says, "There's that Dan Bird guy. We should invite him." And we're all going, "Oh man, don't do that. No." And Cooper says, "No, we're inclusive. Come on, get in the car, Dan." So we go, right? So we're dancing and enjoying ourselves at the deal, and I'll never forget there were go-go dancers up in like a dancing deal up above. And so they're playing music, and I'm dancing on my crutches and having a good time. And all of a sudden, somebody goes, "Oh my God!" And we look up, and there's Dan Bird. And he's still wearing his blue suit with his tie, and he's got sunglasses on. And he's dancing with the go-go dancers in their vinyl boots and all that stuff. And he's right in the middle of them. And I'm going, that's that guy. So that kind of started the deal. That's where the idea came from. And then it might have been the next year, we got to be pretty good friends. And so we were at a conference, and so we decided to do a Blues Brothers routine. It was much later than that when we decided to do the Blues Brothers routine. I think the second time we did it was in Boston. I don't remember the first time where we did it. It was the conference meeting prior to Boston. So anyway, so when we'd started doing this little halftime show at the chapter president's party, and we get out there in our Blues Brothers suits and do the Blues Brothers routine. And I know, I'm sorry. So we did that 3 or 4 times, and then there were the clone wannabes, Knight and others, that decided that they'd do the Blues Brothers. Of course, they could actually play the harmonica and could actually dance, but that's a different issue. But anyway, so we get out there. So we did the Blues Brothers for a while, and then one year he and I decided that was a little passe. And I think as a matter of fact, the first time we did it was in Boston. A movie had just come out called The Full Monty, and with Donna Summer's song. And we said, this Blues Brothers is getting a little old. Why don't we do the Full Monty? And so, you can't do a Full Monty at the conference, right? So we said, we actually went out and bought a little stereo and a little DVD of Donna Summers, and we practiced in the room a little bit. So we get out there in Boston, and we start off with the Blues Brothers. And of course, this is like with the DJ at the party, and there's a couple hundred people watching, and it's kind of... So we get out there, we start off with blues music, right? And we're doing blues stuff. And then they switch to Donna Summers, hot stuff. So we immediately start into the da-da-da-da, bum, bum. So we basically stripped down to, slacks and T-shirts, but we took off shoes and socks and everything. We're out there doing the half Monty. So we did that in Boston. And then the next year was New York, where I got indicted, if I recall correctly, or inducted or whatever to the FAICP. But there we did the half Monty, and we had about 20 men doing it. I don't know if you were involved in that one. Frank Turner was involved, a lot of other men. There was one Australian that wanted to do the Full Monty. We wouldn't let him be involved because he had a little too much to drink. But anyway, so we did that a few times, and then after that we just didn't worry about it too much anymore.
Well, I don't want to brush over the fact that you were inducted into the College of Fellows, and you want to talk a little bit about...
Or as my administrative assistant in Grand Prairie said, I was indicted into the College of Fellows. So. Do
you remember when you first took the AICP exam? And
well, yes.
What did the exam look like back then?
Well, it was on stone tablets, and you had these little markers. But anyway, no, I think I took it the second or third year as available. I was a charter member according to the little certificate, wherever it went. But I just moved to Austin, okay, so that would have been 79 or 80. And I had signed up to do it before I moved to Austin. Then I moved to Austin. I'm living in an apartment out of boxes, and and trying a new job, and there's no way I could study for it. So I said, this is going to be a 2-phase deal. I'm just going to go take the test and figure out where I need to study next. And of course, we didn't have any AICP prep things or anything. And at the time, everybody said you should take AICP immediately after you get out of college because you remember all the history of planning and all the other things. So you're more of a generalist when you get fresh out of college instead of when you're in the job for 3 or 4 years, and you tend to get isolated on zoning or whatever. So anyway, so I said this is going to be a 2 or 3 phase process, and I'll just take the test. Now, I'll be damned if I didn't pass it by 1. I mean, it's like a D minus. I don't know, 71, 70 was passing or something. I mean, just barely passed. But, good enough. So I.
But it was the multiple choice exam.
But it was the multiple choice exam, and some of them were. It was horrible. Some of them were which choice is more right, and which B and D above. I mean, it was just terrible.
And so, 20 some odd years later, you were inducted into the college?
I was. Yes, it would have been, 2000, 2001, I think. I was the second fellowship group. And and like I said, it was actually kind of embarrassing because I was sitting there with some of the pioneers of planning because, they reached way back and were bringing some of these folks forward. And some of these folks were in their 80s and 90s, but they were just, some of the epic planners. And so I'm sitting there at the ceremony, and like I said, I discovered the reason I was sitting there, because I'm looking at them and hearing all their stuff, going, why am I here? And it turned out it was all the work I'd done with the colonias and low-income housing in the valley in my very first years in planning. So, forget about horse racing tracks and, redeveloping areas next to universities. Those colonias were really impressed the committee. So,
Well, you have alluded to a lot of the fun you've had at the national conferences. Can you think about some of the chapter conferences?
actually, I'm fairly notorious. Like the conference in San Antonio at the old Tropicana Hotel, the Holiday Inn on the river, which turned out to be a little dry fingerling. But when I flooded out the keynote speaker, because I was taking a bath on a Friday afternoon.
Who I believe was Joel Garreau.
Yes, nationally known, yes. Well, and I also flooded out the table that the Austin Planning and Zoning Commission was sitting at. But I was reading a book in the tub, and of course later everybody said, why were you reading a book in the tub and letting it, it wasn't overflowing, it was just going out the drain. But they said, why are you taking a bath on a Friday afternoon at a conference? And I said, have you ever had young kids that want to float their boats and put their ducks in there and do all this stuff? I said, I had a little bit of peace and quiet, so I took it. And I can't help it if the overflow connection wasn't hooked up on the tub, because the hotel was so old. So that one I hadn't even been drinking. I was famous for that one. Matter of fact, I was going down when the maintenance people told me I flooded out the speaker down below. I was going to go down and see about it, and Jim Duncan invited me into the bars, and he says, yeah, we were sitting there and it was flood. There was soapy water was pouring out of the ceiling, and they were bringing out ladders while this poor guy's trying to speak. And finally, he said, I just can't do this anymore. I said, really? He looks at me, my hair's still wet. He says, no. I said, yeah, really. And he says, oh, come here. He brings over a couple of Austin commissioners and the keynote speaker and says, this is the guy. So thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. So, but yeah, oh gosh. I mean, the infamous tour of Juarez at the El Paso conference, where Rose Jacobson hurt herself a little bit, and I believe David Pugh was asked to leave the dog park because he had brought meat from dinner and was throwing it out there with the dogs when they were racing, and a few other things like that. The debacle that was the bus ride back. Yeah. So.
I remember a sunrise trip to Galveston from the Houston.
Oh, you would bring that up, yes. Yeah.
I can think of a few.
Yeah, well, I was the only person that had beer in their bathtub at 2 a.m, so somebody's pounding on the door, and for some reason, I can't answer the phone, but for some reason I had very little on in bed, and so I go to the door and just crack it a little bit, and there's like 80 people in the hallway saying, you've got beer, and they charge the door, so I barely made it back to my covers. So anyway, so I'm sitting there, and then it dawned on me about 2 or 3 in the morning that these people weren't going to go to bed. So finally I said, we got to go watch the sunrise in Galveston. So we had an 18-passenger van, and so we took Lucy Stewart and Lisa and various other planners, and drove to Galveston and watched the sunrise. Who else was there? We should bring all their names into this.
And then I remember a flood in the stockyards.
Oh, at the White Elephant.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't dancing on the table that one, was I?
I believe you were.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there were witnesses. Yeah, we were stranded at the White Elephant because of all the flooding, so we tended to drink a little too much. And that was the conference where they had the hailstorm that busted out all the hotel windows and car windows and stuff. And what would that be? That was in the early 80s, if I recall.
Something like that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I rode back to Austin. Matter of fact, with Sally Shipman, the Austin council member, who had her windshield all busted out. So we were driving kind of slow. So.
Well, we've gone through your career. Can you think back of any mentors that kind of
mentors?
Your career?
Oh yeah,
that you've looked up to.
There's numerous mentors. First mentor was probably Mike Blum in McAllen. He was actually graduate A&M. He's been in McAllen his whole life, not his whole life, but since he got out of college. But he was their first planner, and then he ended up being assistant city manager, and then he started his own real estate business, and he's one of the big real estate firms down there. Anybody that knows anything about the Rio Grande Valley knows to go see Mike to find out about anything. Been on their utility board and stuff, but he taught me a lot about the politics of planning. How you really got to think through, just because the ordinance makes sense to you doesn't mean that politically it's going to work. And if you don't think through the politics of just about anything you do. He also taught me how to read the enabling statutes, which was kind of interesting. That's how, and matter of fact, that's where I got all my platting experience. It was with the colonias, because they don't plat; they just, give land to each other and build their houses on the wrong parcels and stuff. So I learned about all the benefits of platting, and that came to fruition later in Dallas, working with all the big development firms, because they were doing platting in a weird way, and I was arguing it was against the law. They dragged me down to Albert Half with about 200 engineers and developers to argue that point. When it was done, I'd showed them that, if you don't file a plat and don't get the city to approve it, you could do all kinds of illegal things. And so I convinced him otherwise. So he's a mentor. I digressed a bit there. I would. There's people like Dennis Wilson. I mean, I'd call him a mentor, even though he's a good friend. I'm really impressed with George Schrader, the former city manager of Dallas. I did a lot of work with him, and he's a mentor of mine. I admire the heck out of him.
How about the other side? Any proteges that you're particularly proud of?
Actually, I've got people that have worked for me at one point or the other in all kinds of positions. I don't know if I'd call them proteges. I don't know if they would claim me as a mentor. But, Teresa O'Donnell worked for me at one point. Mark Guy and Carrollton worked for me for a long time. Actually, I was with him longer than I was with my first wife from various cities. You just run down the list of, there's a lot of people in major planning positions that worked for me at one point or another. And that's probably a good thing, because I learned what not to do, so.
If you had to give advice to a young planner, what would it be?
The career path in planning is kind of weird. I mean, you think you've got it well organized. Don't stay in one place too long, especially if things are going south. But at the same time, don't necessarily jump around too much and leave too early. I think you need to picture where you want to be eventually. If you're a modeler for transportation or something like that, you may want to go with one of the bigger agencies. But if you want to end up being a planning director, I'd recommend going out to one of the smaller communities. Not too small. It's got to have something going on. But town of 25,000 or something, and there you can cut your teeth. And it's really good if you can come in as an assistant director under somebody that really knows the ropes, and then later maybe move on to your own town. But that's kind of what happened to me. I mean, I was a planning director. 3 years after started my first job, I was the planning director of McAllen. So I think you need to think about where you want to end up. Don't be afraid to go consulting. I've always advocated, and my own personal career has followed that. When you get tired of city work and get tired of the taxpayers yelling about things, then you go to work as a consultant. And then when, after you get tired of the pressure of the budgets and getting the projects done on time and, making a profit, go back to city work. And I think the pressure is about the same, just different on both sides. So that'd be my advice. I think you need to think about the long term. My real piece of advice is, if you're going to be a Texas planner in a city, never ever take your money out of TMRS. TMRS is the best thing ever, because when you reach 57 years of age, you can retire and be just perfectly happy. And if you're planning right, you can be a millionaire, like some planners I know, unlike myself.
You've mentioned your kids. Are any of them going to follow you into the profession?
Well, one might, although I've kind of recommended he not follow my exact footsteps, because I've got a daughter that's an engineer. I don't know where that came from. I've got another daughter that wants to be a psychologist. I know where that came from. And then my son, he's out at the University of Arizona, and he's waffling a little bit, and he's kind of thinking about planning, but he's one that I don't think he's a very good consensus builder. That's another thing. I think I do pretty well as consensus building, so I think he'll have to tailor. If he does go into planning, it may have to be more environmental planning or more of a specialty, but I don't know if he'll get there, but he's always been kind of interested in the planning side. So, although his quote in, I want to say, the 4th grade, when they were talking about what you want to be when you grow up, he said he wanted to be an urban planner like his dad, because he wouldn't have to study as hard. So.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't touched on?
I hadn't even thought about that. So, planning's been a good ride. I love planners. I mean, we are so diverse and so much fun, and to some extent so crazy and so weird. It's just great. I mean, you go to, I've been to national ICMA conferences in Des Moines with the city managers, and I wouldn't call it exactly the most exciting conference I've ever been to. I mean, city managers have their own set of issues they have to deal with, but they tend to be a little more straight-laced than some of us planners. So, when we set the all-time record for number of margaritas consumed at Louis' backyard, it still stands, as I understand. Mainly because college students can't afford margaritas; they can only drink beer. But still, I mean, it's been fun. We're supportive of each other, I think, for the most part. I mean, we have our disagreements and stuff, but it's a great organization. I love the conferences. I love the people, and I love doing the work. It's never boring. You're never stuck in doing just one thing. I mean, every day you come to work and, oh boy, let's see what happens. So it's been a great ride. I'd recommend it to anybody.
Okay. Craig, I appreciate you spending time with us.
No worries.
Okay.